Hi all, today a quick overview of the rebellions of 1837, 1838. This is going to be, like all lectures in this course, pretty short, pretty brief, pretty succinct, meaning we're not going to get into any detail here, but just to cover the really basics of the political and economic dimensions of the rebellions, just to give you a bit of a framework for our discussions tomorrow. Really stepping back, basic information you should know, but some of you may not. Some of you I know are taking your first Canadian courses. So just to step back a bit, a reminder that prior to 1763, most of the territory that we now live in Canada was French territory. That in the Seven Years' War, the British defeat the French and capture that territory that is now the provinces, well, residual parts of Nova Scotia, but also the main parts of Quebec and Ontario. And here you can see that the Treaty of Paris outlines the territory. This also includes the Royal Proclamation lines and the 13 colonies would become the United States. That sets the status quo for a time after the war, after the 7 Years' War, but that changes dramatically very, very quickly because not long after the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution takes place. And of course, that means the boundaries change yet again. So this line, which we kind of think of course, as the rightly think of as the border between Canada and the United States, is formed in 1791 after the peace treaties, excuse me, that are signed in 1783, and then new borders and new political arrangements are established by the British in the decade after that. So the big feature here is two. One, this border, the international border between the United States and British territory, and then this border here, which divides what was the French colony and then later the British colony of Canada into two. And this is a direct response, as we can see here, to the Loyalists. And of course, the Loyalists are those Americans. It's important to stress that they are Americans. Some of them were born in Britain, but most of them were born in the United States, or what has become the United States, who had remained loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolution and fled into Canada. Most of them end up in either Nova Scotia or Upper Canada, or what would become Upper Canada, which at that point was still the larger former French colony of Canada. So the Constitution Act responds to the new political and demographic realities of these people arriving both in Nova Scotia and in Canada. Now we're going to focus much more heavily on Canada here than Nova Scotia, but I'll just point to a couple of quick things along the way that are also part of this. So it divides that colony into two new colonies, one Upper Canada, one Lower Canada. Upper Canada is Ontario. You're going further up the river, right? And Lower Canada. Upper Canada is going to be for British Anglo Protestant peoples, primarily those loyalists. Some loyalists certainly end up in Lower Canada. Montreal has a substantial loyalist population. But in terms of a mass of people, many, many, many more of them end up in what becomes Ontario than what becomes Quebec. So you're going to have two colonies, and effectively one's going to be an English-speaking Protestant colony, and the other one's going to be a French-speaking Catholic colony. In response, and this is kind of a legacy of the Quebec Act, but they're going to have separate legal systems. And in fact, this is one of the things that really pushed the Loyalists to demand that these new colonies be created, these separate colonies be created, because the law under the Quebec Act, 1774, the law in Canada was the old French legal system. And so when these Loyalists arrive in Canada, they're somewhere between confused and angry that they've arrived in a place where British law apparently does not apply. Now, it certainly applied. That's not accurate, though that's how they characterized it. But certainly the basic systems of property were following the old French system, not the British system. So they were unhappy with that. So they wanted a new legal system that reflected that. So that's what they do. They create two legal jurisdictions. In Lower Canada, they'll keep the old French law. In Upper Canada, they will move into a British common law system. And that's the same system that exists today. Quebec law continues to be governed by the Civil Code, which is a later development of the French Code, the French Civil Code. And Upper Canada is a common law system, much like Canada, Australia, parts of the United States, Australia, and so on. They're very much in that British system. They're also going to have separate assemblies. And this is an innovation in Canada because Canada hadn't had an assembly before. But again, this highlights the Americanness of these people. We think of these people as loyalists. We think of them as people who were loyal to the crown and all that kind of stuff. But they weren't monarchists. They were born and raised, well, most of them born, certainly all of them raised and lived in the American colonies. They were used to having a democratic assembly to represent their interests. And for that matter, the British Parliament certainly exists. It's not a republican system as would emerge in the United States, but it's still a broadly democratic system. It has certainly lots of undemocratic elements in it, but that's another story. So they're going to create these two new assemblies. And this really points to kind of the nub of the problem that's going to emerge politically in both Upper and Lower Canada. Because while the British created assemblies here, that does not mean they created equal assemblies. And what you'll find is that if you look at these in any kind of detail, is that the assemblies that they create are far less democratic than the ones that existed in the old American colonies, what are now the United States. And what you'll see in the old colonies, even before the Revolution, one of the great myths of the American Revolution is that they kind of invent democracy. That's nonsense. All the colonies had assemblies before the Revolution. And most of them were really quite democratic. They have quite extensive voting suffrage and so on. The American Revolution was about what Americans perceived as the British trying to invade into that territory, to try to begin to rule more directly over the colonists, rather than kind of creating something out of a whole cloth new. So the response in the Upper and Lower Canada is to create a more centralized assembly, a government system that was much more centralized, and much more top-heavy, meaning much more of the responsibility lay at the top with the governor and an appointed council than it did with the elected members in the assembly down below. And so the campaign is the wrong word, but the protest position of the rebels throughout the 1830s, actually beginning in the 1820s, is to democratize the system, to decentralize the system, to give greater weight and greater importance to the assemblies, and therefore to the people who elect members to the assemblies. Let me take you quickly through what that means, just so you have a kind of rough sense of that. The structures of government in British North America had three levels. They had a governor at the top, who was appointed by the British government, of course, directly, almost always a British figure, an imperial figure, a military figure of some sort. Then a legislative council, and that's an appointed council that reports directly to the governor and is appointed by the governor. And then at the very bottom you have the legislative assembly, and those are the elected members. And they, of course, represent the people. So much of the politics of the rebellions is about trying to basically bypass the legislative council. If you look at the structure, you might recognize it today. And structurally, it's the same thing we have today, except we don't call it a legislative council. You might think, well, we call it the Senate. No. So the legislative council is appointed here by the governor. What the rebels, what the reformers want, is the legislative council to be appointed from people who have already been elected to the assembly. And so the struggle becomes one for responsible government. So here's how it works. It's pyramidal, governors at the top, elected assemblies at the bottom. What they're really looking for is something to represent the people, the mass of the people. They're the people who elect members to the elected assembly. So where does this legislative council come from? Well, it comes from the governor. And the governor gets to appoint whoever he wants to the legislative council. Now, typically, these are highly political appointments, and they reflect politics, economics, religion, prestige, status in the community. So you've got, and these are kind of just random people in fancy red jackets that I'm showing you here, but the governor looks around kind of the finer sort of Upper and Lower Canadian societies and appoints people to represent the British government in this legislative council. So this is roughly what you end up with, is a body at the bottom, the assembly, which represents the people, legislative council in the middle, that represents kind of the elite of the colony, mostly local native-born people, but some of them are British-born, but most of them are native-born people, and then the governor at the top. Legislation moves up through the system. In other words, it's created in the assembly, and then it has to be approved by the legislative council, and then it goes on to the governor, and the governor has to approve it as well. And if legislation doesn't get approved at the council or the governor's level, it means it dies. And what the reformers point out continually is that this means that you don't really have a democratic government. It means that any kind of reform, anything that supports popular initiatives, people's initiatives, can be quashed by the elite. And they say this is happening all the time. That becomes the basis for the call for reform. And if you know anything about American revolutionary history, this is not that different. Excuse me, it's slightly different, but not that different. There's a whole bunch of particular issues that you might have come across in high school classes or whatever. In Upper Canada, there's the clergy reserves, where lands were set aside from the settlement blocks, which were held for the churches, particularly for the Church of England. They call them the clergy reserves, reserved for the clergy. It doesn't mean land for clergymen; it means for the church. And the idea here was that the sales of these lands would support the state church. They would allow them to build churches and pay ministers and that sort of thing. So what ordinary people pointed out was that this was a block on development, because these lands often didn't get sold, or often held back for speculative reasons. But when they were, so it blocks development. And when they are sold, they're sold for the benefit of the official state church, not for ordinary people. And in Upper Canada in particular, you have a wide group of religious groups practicing in Upper Canada, but they're by no means not all Anglicans. You have Wesleyan Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians and all kinds of other non-state church people. And they're saying, well, this is a tax that we're paying for their religion. And so this becomes a popular rallying cry in this period. There's also all kinds of money being spent on expensive imperial projects. For example, the Rideau Canal, which is really designed for defense purposes much more than it is for trade purposes. It certainly serves value as a trade, as a bit of trade infrastructure, if you will. But the location, the timing, the money that's put into it is imperial money, and it's meant to provide improved ability to move troops around the colonies, much more so than products around the colonies. And so you can see this here in the Rideau Canal, constructed 1826 to 1832. They spent almost £1 million building that, a hell of a lot of money in that time period, as opposed to the Welland Canal here in our region in Niagara, which gets paid for by local monies, not by imperial monies, and they only get about 50 or 60,000 pounds to build their canal. And if any of you have ever seen the remnants of the original Welland Canal, that remnants exist in various parts around the Niagara region. If you go to what's the name of that restaurant? There's a restaurant on Glendale. There's a section of the canal in there behind there. It looks like a ditch. It's not an impressive canal like the one built in Ottawa, and that reflects money. And of course, this is a trade route, not a military route. It's designed to move goods and people around Niagara to improve access to the Great Lakes and to broader trade patterns. But this is a local development. Not nearly as much money goes into that. So a kind of popular cry emerges, and this is a version of it that you see in Lower Canada, but it's very much the same in Upper Canada. Pensez bien. Think about it. The call comes for having an elected council. And by elected council, I don't mean necessarily elected directly to the council, but that the council members, that middle strata, would be chosen from the elected assembly. And there you can see the connection to the modern cabinet, because that's exactly what we do in the modern cabinet again today. What have we to fear by demanding an elected council? Le Minerve asked in January of 1832. Would it be increasing the power of the people, the present legislative council being of the greatest nuisance? We must take the necessary means to get rid of it. Think about it, pensez bien, from 1832. There, the Upper Canadian and Lower Canadian rebels are very much on the same page. It's a constitutional issue, changing the structure of the government to make it more responsible to the people. But it's different in Quebec, different in Lower Canada, because to go back to who those figures are, those elite figures that are chosen to be on that legislative council, appointed to be on that legislative council, they largely represent British interests. This comes to a head in the spring and summer of 1837. There's a whole series of organizations underway. Here's one of the Lower Canadian leaders, Louis-Joseph Papineau, addressing a crowd in the Six Counties region of Lower Canada. It's a popular assembly. You can see the flags being waved there. See, Irish flags, which is interesting, of course. These are flags which point to the Catholic struggle for emancipation against Britain as well. Lots of French Canadians and Irish Canadians, immigrants, and Irish people find common cause as a people who are occupied, Catholic peoples who are occupied by the British. So in the 1837 rather, you see the kind of a mobilization of people and forming a political party, a party that they go on to call the Le Parti Patriote, the Patriot Party. And this is unusual. This is early for parties. I don't know if you know this, but no, either in the United States or Canada, you don't have or Britain for that matter, you don't have organized political parties yet. What you have are kind of groups forming in the parliaments and the senates and so on. Where loose coalitions form and dissolve all the time. So having formal parties don't exist. So this is fairly early to have a formal political party organized in this kind of basis. And it's formed as a basis of opposition to the British. They also begin to train a patriot militia, which is to say to get people out in the countryside, practicing using weapons, practicing military discipline, practicing for armed insurrection. And of course, they don't know this is going to happen, but they think that it's increasingly likely to happen. And of course, this becomes an issue of debate within reform circles. Some reformers want to keep it a strictly political movement. Others say, no, look, the British are simply not listening to us. We must mobilize. And of course, they're looking at the American example. It's 50 years later, but the American state at this point is proving to be effective and resilient. They don't know the Civil War is coming, but they're prospering in many ways. They're looking at this as a really viable option for their future as well. And how did they get there? Well, they got there through armed opposition. You also see a series of street battles emerging. And we saw references to this in the film last week, Ted Desam. Where we remember that when the rebels show up at the Walker House, they're talking about the fights that they were seeing on the streets, and they talk about the Doric Society. They talk about the Fil de Liberté. The Doric Society was a British English-speaking group, mostly of young men, who were kind of politically active and vehemently supportive of the British cause, and viewed the French Canadians as communists, as rebels, as unpatriotic people who were a threat to the British order. The Fil de la Liberté, of course, take their name from the American Revolution, the Sons of Liberty, which is an American revolutionary organization. So they're really drawing on that American revolutionary model for going forward. We can have a discussion in our class tomorrow about whether that's Republican or not, but that's another matter altogether. We'll pursue that later. They also, and this is interesting, they organize a constitutional convention, which again is modeled on the American example. The Americans hold their constitutional convention in Philadelphia, where the Constitution of the United States is actually drawn up. So they're using the same terminology, the same language to describe their organizations. The outcome of all of this in November of 1837 is the imposition of martial law. I do want you to look at Jean-Marie Factot's article, that opening paragraph or two in particular, where he outlines kind of the story of the revolution. Oftentimes, that story is told as martial law as a response to violence. He wants you to think of that story differently, and I think there's a right little bit of conversation to be had there in our conversations tomorrow. An actual battle does break out in November of 1837 at a village called Saint-Denis, which is just up the St. Lawrence River from Montreal, the South Shore. It's not a big battle. It's not nearly as well organized as this picture would have you believe. This is drawn from a history of the Dominion of Canada and drawn some years later. It shows a disciplined force of patriot soldiers chasing a kind of ragtag band of British soldiers fleeing in disarray. They look like they're in order in the back, but at the front they're abandoning their cannons, and soldiers are dying all over the place. It looks like proper European-style warfare. It's probably not how it happened. It was probably the Patriots. We'll see some of the Patriots in a few minutes, but probably a little bit more ragtag than this would suggest. But it was a patriotic victory where the rebels defeat the British Army. That doesn't last long. The British organize more troops. Of course, over the next few months, they'll be bringing troops from Upper Canada. They'll be bringing troops from Nova Scotia. They'll be bringing ships from Nova Scotia with cannons and so on to try to better control the countryside. But they march back up the Richelieu River a few days later, and at a village called Saint-Charles, Saint-Charles-sur-Richelieu, on the 24th of November 1837, another battle breaks out, and this time the British defeat the Patriots. And you can see we're going to see a couple of these paintings that kind of do this. They try to collapse lots of dimensions of a long day's battle into one scene. And you can see here in the foreground the British troops lined up behind the fences. And you can see off in the distance people running away. Those are the fleeing Patriot soldiers. But you might think, why are they fleeing when they're so far apart? Well, the scene in the middle is kind of where that time collapse takes place. That's where the actual battle is taking place. You can see another smaller battle on the hillside off in the distance. It's not meant to capture one view, but several scenes, several moments of the battle, all in one painting here. There's a whole series of battles. We don't need to go through them. A couple of them takes place in November and December of 1837. And increasingly, as the British get more soldiers into the field, and as the limited supplies of the rebels become an issue very, very quickly, they have poor weaponry, poor ammunition supplies, and so on. It becomes pretty clear that the British have a decided advantage in any kind of battle or military situation. And it ends effectively, at least the first stage of the rebellion ends on 14th of December 1837 at Saint-Eustache, just west of Montreal, where the rebels had attempted to try to consolidate a position in this village. The British attack, and it's a decisive defeat of the Patriot Army. It's an interesting picture. Get my pointer going. I'm not sure if you probably can't see my pointer, so I won't use my pointer. I will draw a little bit. See here in the church, see people jumping out of windows because the church is on fire. This building's on fire as well. Here are British soldiers. But this again is one of these moments where the entire battle is collapsed into one picture. There was a battle here in the foreground. These guys, the Patriots, eventually flee back into the village where they take shelter in these buildings. The British attack those buildings, burn the buildings, and that's the defeat of the Patriots that day. Again, this kind of interesting approach to showing how to portray the image. Anyhow, the following spring, many of the rebel leadership are arrested. A subsequent rebellion breaks out in the fall, but it's short-lived as well. This is, by the way, happening in Upper Canada as well. Not on as large a scale, but it's still happening in Upper Canada as well. We're just not talking about that here today. I want to really, really quickly say, I've seen this 100 times in introductory courses where students, for some reason, I don't know if this is somehow an impression they get in high school, or high school teachers are just telling them the wrong thing, or I have the faintest idea, but a lot of people seem to think for some reason that Upper Canada and Lower Canada are fighting against each other. This is not the case at all. The Lower Canadian and Upper Canadian rebellions are fighting a common cause. They're not coordinating their activities closely like happened in the United States, and that might have been a good idea. But they are certainly fighting a common cause. Men will be hanged in Upper Canada as well for rebellion, in fact, within days of each other. The movie that you're going to see is taking place just before this moment. What you're going to see in the film is some of these men as they await their fate, as they discuss their failed rebellion, as they discuss their families, as they discuss their lives, as they know the noose awaits them any day. So who are the Patriots? Again, we saw bits of this in the film last week, but I'll just highlight this here for you today. The vast majority of them, the vast majority of the people that composed the army, the Patriot Army, were ordinary farmers, some tradesmen, blacksmiths, people like that. Most of them were habitant farmers. We don't have very much detailed knowledge of them as individuals, except the ones that are arrested and executed. We don't have very much visual imagery too. I showed you these paintings earlier of the battles, but those are done by British officers, and they're meant to really kind of show off the fact that the British are ably defeating these rebels. this is an actual painting of some of the rebels themselves. And that's a really interesting painting. It really gives you a sense of who these people were, and most particularly of their military capacity. This is done by Jane Ellis. She is the daughter of a British military official in one of those villages on the Richelieu River. And their house has been taken over by the Patriot rebels, and they're effectively being held hostage inside their own home. Jane Ellis is a young woman. I think she's 18 or 19 when she does this, but she does this little watercolor sketch of the rebels outside her house. And so it's a really lovely portrait of who they are. You can see they're not soldiers. They are dressed like farmers. They are dressed like French Canadian farmers. They're dressed for winter. And they are certainly not dressed for warfare. Look at the weaponry. This man, whoops, sorry. Damn marker keeps going out. This man has a sword. This man has a pike. 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 That leaves us with a sum total of 2 rifles for this group of men. You will not defeat the British Army in 1837 with this kind of military capacity. It's just not going to happen. And as we saw in earlier battles as well, even if they had rifles, they didn't have much ammunition. So their military capacity is very weak. They're also led by an elite leadership. And this is by far the most important of these men, Louis-Joseph Papineau, who is certainly considered the key leading figure. We saw him earlier in that speech at 6 Counties. But I want you to see him here in a portrait, one of 7 portraits I could have chosen to show you, along with his wife Julie and their daughter, whose name escapes me right off the top of my head. I want you to see them for who they are. These are not poor farmers. These are they are seigneur owners. They're wealthy. In fact, Papineau will die one of the wealthiest men in Lower Canada. He will do very, very well through all of this. But he's a liberal. He's a reformer, and he's a French Canadian nationalist. He wants to see reforms that will reflect his people in the legislature. Now, later, when the dust settles and he's able to return to a kind of normal political life, we'll see that he's actually fairly conservative. One of the things he attacks most vehemently are votes for women. So don't imagine him to be a radical liberal of any sort. He's not. But he certainly sees that the French Canadian people are in a weak position in a society that really they should be the dominant figures in. And so that's really kind of what's mobilizing him. He wants to assist in that kind of world. Finally, a third group we can point to are people like this. And again, we met this man in the film last week in that little rebel section in the middle of the movie. We didn't meet him, but we saw those 2 rebels who show up at the Walker House. So they were talking about this guy. This is Wilfred Nelson. He's a doctor. Most importantly, he's English. And here he is in Lower Canada, supporting and actively leading. He'll be one of the field commanders and most of the military engagements of the rebel forces. He supports the rebel cause. He supports the French Canadian cause. I think in this case, most particularly, he supports the liberal cause, that is to say, the democratic cause. But it's worth noting that he's not alone. And again, the Walker story is I think a fictionalized story. It doesn't represent a real person. But there were elite English families in Lower Canada who were still liberals, who still supported democratization of their society, and probably too saw that the French Canadian people needed a stronger role in their own society. The rebellion failed. Here are 2 flags. I don't know if these would have become the national flags had they succeeded. The Upper Canadian Liberty flag, again, very much modeled on an American-style Republican democracy, red, white, and blue stars, stripes, all those kinds of basic elements. The Lower Canadian one, very much different, very much less Republican in an explicit orientation, but trying to make, again, that green, that connection with the Irish, and showing a kind of, and it's useful, I think, to think of this as an anti-colonial politics. We think typically of anti-colonial politics in terms of people who are racialized people, slaves, indigenous people, and so on. Indians in India later in the 19th century as occupied by the British Empire. But this is, white Christian people. They're Catholics, not Protestants, but still Christians, and they're white. But they see themselves under the yoke of the British Empire as well. And so that drawing of common cause with the Irish is important. In 1838, the British government appoints this guy, John George Lambton, better known as Lord Durham, to come to Canada and to report on the rebellion. So now, Durham's a really interesting guy. We don't have time to talk about him very much here. But it's worth noting that he is not a conservative. He's a liberal. In fact, he's one of the leading reform politicians in Great Britain. So it's a bit unusual that they would have chosen somebody like Durham to come to report on these rebel reform activities, because he's, at least in theory, broadly sympathetic with their basic aims. He doesn't tour around very much, but he holds a series of hearings in Quebec City and in Toronto, maybe in Kingston as well. I'm not sure about that, I forget. But a couple of locations around the colonies where he hears people's assessments, views on what happened and why it happened. So this is kind of an investigation. And he writes a report, and this is the title of the report. The report on the affairs of British North America from the Earl of Durham, Her Majesty's High Commissioner, which is published the following year in 1839. This is a 600-page long report, but there's some recommendations that are worth focusing on. I'd like to focus on two. First, he writes, the natural state of government in all these colonies is that of a collision between the executive and the representative body. And there he shows himself to be in agreement with the reformers. So he recommends that the British government actually offer to the colonies responsible government, exactly what the rebels have been asking for. The British are not going to go along with this. No government will ever reward rebels with what they want. But he sees, Durham sees, that if there's not reform here, these problems will continue. So he recommends that they do this. But he doesn't see it as strictly a constitutional battle. In fact, he, in his report, this is the second key recommendation I'd like you to focus on, focuses on the ethnic dimension of this. Now, in Upper Canada, there isn't much of an ethnic dimension, which means that his second key analysis doesn't really apply in Upper Canada, but it becomes a leading element in the British response to the rebellions. He says, I came to Canada expecting to find a constitutional conflict, the one he's just pointed to. He says, but instead what I found, and this is one of the most famous phrases in Canadian history, two nations, French and English, warring in the bosom of a single state. Now, of course, it's not a single state. It's Upper Canada and Lower Canada. But he sees this French-Canadian struggle against the British Empire in Lower Canada as two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. Now this has zero applicability in Upper Canada, but he sees it as having applicability to the general situation. And to deal with the general situation, the British see a way to handle it. Take those two colonies, Upper Canada and Lower Canada, and unite them into one colony. This will solve the problems of democratic and constitutional reform in the Canadas. The idea here is to ignore, for the time being at least, the responsible government question. And you can imagine some policy people in London going, maybe in 10 years we can talk about this, but not today, not after this, not just right after the rebellion like this. But this is good. And what this allows the British government to do is to effectively blame the French Canadians for this. And by merging the two colonies into one, at a time when they're driving settlers into the colonies, they think, yeah, you know what? If we merge these two colonies together, eventually we will swamp the French. In other words, we will demographically dominate the French in this new unified state. And so the result is that these two colonies, Upper Canada and Lower Canada, become the United Canadas, as they will remain until Confederation in 1867. So that's kind of the key stuff I want us to focus on, the major outcomes. Our readings don't deal so much with the British response, with Durham and the British response, but their analysis goes a long way to understanding how the British handled it at the time. In our readings this week, though, we're going to try to spend more of our time trying to understand the rebel position, trying to understand how they understood 1837, 1838. Look forward to our conversation tomorrow. Take care, all of you. Bye-bye.